Has anyone ever told you to not think about theology so much and just focus on a personal relationship with God? Well, that's a theology called pietism. Hey guys, welcome back to Kingdom Craft, where we build churches in Minecraft while talking about Christianity. Today I'm making some finishing touches on my house in this Presbyterian province of Covenantia. So then after that I can start building a new Presbyterian church somewhere over here. And today I'm going to be talking about pietism. Pietism was a movement in Lutheran churches in Europe during the 1700s. So why the heck does it matter for us today? Well, yes, the movement started then and there, but it doesn't just apply to Lutherans. It doesn't just apply to Protestants. It had an impact on all of Christianity, including even Catholic and Orthodox churches, and later I'm going to explain why. Even though Catholics and Orthodox both claim to be the one true church, they cannot deny that they have been influenced in various ways by Protestantism, and one of the examples of that is the massive influence that Lutheran pietism has had on all forms of Christianity. So, for the longest time, I had no idea what pietism was. I didn't know what that word meant. I didn't have that in my vocabulary. But I still had seen examples of it. I just didn't have a label for it. Here's the biggest example I saw of it, and it was at my university. So, the university I went to, and I still go to, I'm nearing the end of my college career, but the university I went to, it's not really an explicitly religious school anymore, but it was still way more religious than the very atheist secular high school in the very leftist part of the country where I grew up. I grew up in New York, and my high school, it was very weird to be religious at all. Almost everyone was atheist in my high school. I could barely find any other Christians in my school, and there were no active young people in my church besides me. So, my social life was pretty hard in high school, partially because I questioned the mainstream leftist narratives. The only friends I had were at the church Bible study, but the Bible studies were like me and 10 boomers. So my best friends junior year of high school were people like Marge and George and Susan. So high school was really rough. So what I loved about going to college was there was a great diversity, lots of different Christian ministries. And although not all of them were perfect, none of them were perfect, they all had some sorts of problems here and there. But no matter what, all of them were a huge improvement from my high school. But I did notice right off the bat that there was a difference between these campus ministries. They did prioritize different things. So I checked out a few of them. I settled in this one campus ministry. I'm not going to name it because, I'm going to make some criticisms here. And besides, most of you probably have never heard of this because it's very specific to the region that my school is in. There was this one campus ministry I got very involved with in the beginning of my freshman year. And this ministry really specialized in fostering community and friendship. And still, to this day, most of the friends I've made in college was originally through this campus ministry. So it's been a huge blessing. It was very good at fostering community, very good at fellowship, very good at just, giving people an introduction to Christian spirituality. Now, within this campus ministry, within this larger campus ministry, there was a smaller club called Deep Dives. Deep Dives was for people in that campus ministry who wanted to go really deep into nerdy theology. Deep Dives, it was always my favorite part of the week. On Sunday afternoons, we would gather in the student center and talk about all sorts of nerdy theology topics and debates and stuff. And a lot of my, ideas about different Christian denominations originally came from the conversations I had with people in Deep Dives, because in my freshman year of college, I didn't have my Redeemed Zoomer platform like I do now. So a lot of it, not all of it, a lot of it also came from conversations with my girlfriend and our mutual friend, but a lot of it came from the conversations I had with people in Deep Dives. Deep Dives, I loved it because, I'm a Presbyterian. Presbyterians are very intellectual. Deep Dives was all about intellectual, nerdy, scholastic theology. But eventually there started to be a bit of friction between Deep Dives and the broader ministry as a whole, because Deep Dives was more focused on the scholastic, nerdy theology, whereas the broader ministry was more focused on a personal relationship with God and community and stuff like that. And they were worried that the nerdy theology, like Calvinism debates that we were talking about, would scare people away, not just from that campus ministry, but would scare people away from Christianity overall. That was a concern they had, and eventually it resulted in an actual schism. Yes, make fun of Protestants all you want. We schism so much that even our individual college campus ministries have schisms. That is what happened eventually. Eventually, our deep dive group split off from the main campus ministry. It even went so far as one of the leaders of the campus ministry calling the deep dive group Pharisaical, simply for debating passionately about nerdy theology topics. We were trying to tell them that just because we were debating doesn't mean we were hurting fellowship with each other. We tried to say, when I say we, I mean the leaders of deep dive, because I wasn't really involved in that fight myself. I just sort of was pushed along with it. But we were trying to say that iron sharpens iron. It's not bad to have nerdy theology debates. It kind of gives both sides of the debate better theology. You know, most of the church's theology resulted from debates the church had. And to this day, I think iron sharpens iron, the verse from Proverbs, applies to theology debates. I think it's good to argue about theology. I think theology is worth arguing about. A lot of people say, oh, Christians need to be brothers. We shouldn't be fighting about this stuff. Well, here's the thing. Nobody argues more about Star Wars than Star Wars fans. The more somebody cares about Star Wars, the more they're going to argue about Star Wars. People who don't care about Star Wars, or people who only watch, like, The Mandalorian, only watch, like, episodes 4, 5, and 6, and maybe they saw The Force Awakens with their friends, those people aren't going to argue about Star Wars at all, because they don't care. So generally, the more someone cares about something, the more they argue about it. That's why I'm glad when people have theology debates, even if I don't agree with them. It shows that they care. But that wasn't the perspective of the leaders of the campus ministry. They did not like our nerdy theology debates, and because of that, our Deep Dives Club had to split off from them. And of course, our Deep Dives Club fizzled out like less than a year after that whole split happened. But honestly, once that group died out, I needed some outlet to talk about nerdy theology with some people, and that inspired me to get more involved in my Redeem Zoomer stuff. So I guess that ended up working for good, for me at least. But even so, I didn't know what it was called at the time, but there was an underlying theological dispute between the Deep Dives Club and the broader campus ministry, and it's the issue of pietism. This debate between, nerdy scholastic theology versus a personal relationship with God is not a new debate, and it really started in the 1700s with the Lutheran pietists. Because here's why the Lutheran pietist movement started. The stereotype at that time, the stereotype in 18th century Lutheran churches in Germany, was that every sermon was just one big theology lecture. There was no personal advice, no practical theology. It was just like you would show up to your church in, I don't know, Schnitzelburg or whatever German cities are called. I'm sorry, guys. My girlfriend's German. I shouldn't, joke about that. You would show up to your church, and the minister would just give one big lecture on justification and law and gospel, and it would, of course, apply to your personal life, but wouldn't give much of a personal application, and would go really, really deep into nitty-gritty theology debates, and that was kind of it. And the pietists noticed that people were having all these in-depth debates, but weren't really focusing on their personal lives, weren't really focusing on their personal prayer life or their relationship with God. So the pietist movement was a reaction against this. The pietist movement said, we need to stop focusing so much on the nerdy theology. We need to focus more on prayer and personal devotion and community and fellowship. And this is not entirely bad. If there really is a case of those things being neglected, we do need to focus on that. And there is good that came from the pietist movement. Have you ever done a Bible study? Ever? If you have ever done a Bible study, ever, you have been influenced by Lutheran pietists, because although Christians have always studied the Bible, the concept of a small group within a church meeting to study the Bible together, that did not exist until Lutheran pietism. And I've seen many examples of today, even Catholics and Orthodox churches holding Bible studies. Traditionally, like centuries ago, it was not a Catholic thing for individual lay people to study the Bible. The Bible was seen as something that clergy and monks would study, but individual lay people in the Catholic Church used to be discouraged from studying the Bible. That has largely changed. The Catholic Church, I think, has improved, but it's improved by becoming more Protestant. One of the ways the Protestants have influenced the Catholic Church is with Lutheran pietism. Catholic churches have started doing Bible studies, which start out as not just a Protestant thing, but a specifically Lutheran pietist thing. So yeah, that is one way that Protestants influence the Catholic Church, but that's not what this video is about. The point is, there was good that came from the Pietist movement because it encouraged people to focus more on prayer and personal devotion. And the Pietist movement, in many ways, was like parallel to the First Great Awakening. It's just the Pietist movement was more in Germany and the First Great Awakening was in the Americas. I think there was also bad that came from the Pietist movement because I think a lot of liberalism, I think liberal theology was in some way the result of the Pietist movement. Because the Pietist movement, because it focused so much on your personal relationship with God, it made religion, it made Christianity a bit more about your subjective experience of God than about objective theological facts about God. And that's not bad in and of itself. But then Schleiermacher, who was around that same time, he originally came from a Lutheran German context. After that whole Pietist movement had happened, Schleiermacher is the founder of liberal theology. Liberal theology basically says it doesn't even matter if things like the deity of Christ or the resurrection are objectively true. What matters is it's true for you. This whole thing about your truth, in some ways, has distant roots in Lutheran pietism, you could say. So because of that, there is good and bad that comes from pietism. The good is Bible studies. The bad is theological liberalism, subjectivism, all that stuff. I think you could argue that in extreme cases, pietism leads to theological liberalism, but even when it doesn't, like I wouldn't say that college ministry I was in was theologically liberal by any means. It does result in an abandonment of good theology and causes doctrine to be a bit more squishy, a bit more soft, a bit more sentimental. And the problem is that, as R.C. Sproul says, everyone is a theologian. Doctrine and dogma is inevitable. Like Tim Keller has said that if you say doctrine and dogma don't matter, that's a doctrine. That's a dogma. Everyone, no matter what their religion or beliefs are, has some sort of set of dogmas and doctrines and stuff. The question is not, do you have dogma? The question is not, are you dogmatic? The question is, what is your dogma? What is your doctrine? And I think if you do not focus on Christian doctrine enough, if you try and shift the focus away from Christian doctrine, you will end up subconsciously adopting the doctrines and the dogmas of the secular culture. And I kind of did see that in the campus ministry I was a part of, because they would say, like, I don't know, let's have a sermon on restfulness. Like, they had a lot of topical sermons, and I don't really like the idea of campus ministries having sermons at all unless it's done by a real ordained minister, which in the case of this ministry, it wasn't. Like, in more recent years, I've been involved in RUF, which is the Presbyterian campus ministry, and they do have sermons, but it is done by a real ordained minister who was ordained in the PCA, whereas in that other ministry, it would just be sermons done by random student leaders. And that group had a weird way of doing their own type of ordination, but it's still kind of sus in my opinion. But the point was, they would talk about a lot of topics, but there wasn't much exegesis or deep theology behind that. It was kind of basically talking in secular terms about certain topics like, I don't know, peace or joy or love or restfulness. And I'm not saying any of it was liberal, but it did seem kind of soft and squishy and stuff at times. And it didn't seem like there was much theological thought put into it. Like practical theology, with, topics like, how do we live our Christian life in the real world? That is very important, but it needs to flow out of more abstract theology. If you try to skip the step of abstract theology, and then focus only on like the real practical stuff, you'll end up being too influenced by the outside secular world. So that's just a bit of a problem I saw. It's not the biggest problem in the world. I also know of some people who seem to like not be interested in theological debates, just in your average evangelical churches. This doesn't just apply to evangelicals, but I've seen it a lot there. And I'm sorry to say, it seems to be a bit more of a problem for evangelical women than evangelical men. And there are things that men are more likely to do wrong in the church as well. A couple episodes ago, I talked about Christian LARPing, which is almost a uniquely male problem among young men in the church, trying to LARP and use being trad and based as an aesthetic. So there are uniquely male problems. But I think women have a bit more of a problem with pietism than men do. Women have a bit more of a problem with neglecting good theology. And I've talked a lot about how women's circles need better theology. And I think the way to do that is promoting female theologians. I don't think women should be pastors, but I think they should be theologians because, as R.C. Sproul said, everyone already is a theologian anyway. So I think there should be a lot more female lay theologians. I mean, there already are, but I think we need to have even more of that. But in a lot of evangelical churches, I've noticed a lot of women will be like uninterested and even sort of shaming people who are interested in this advanced nerdy theology, saying, "Oh, come on, guys, just like believe in Jesus." Is like, well, as St. Anselm said, theology is just faith seeking understanding. So people who believe in Jesus will often be very curious to learn more about Jesus. I often say, like, if you say you're a Christian, but you're not interested in studying the scriptures or studying theology at all. That's like saying you love the Beatles, but you're not interested in listening to their songs. So it's like, if you love Jesus, you should be interested in learning about Jesus. That's like saying, like, oh, I'm in love with this girl, but I don't need to know anything about her. It's like, bruh, then who even is she? How do you even know who she is if you don't want to know anything about her? So, of course, not everyone needs to have the same level of theological study. Yes, there are a certain class of people who are uniquely called to a more theological vocation than other people. But even so, everyone needs to know a good deal of theology. And I feel like pietism discourages that in some way. So, like I said, there are good things we can learn from pietism, but we also have to be conscious of how pietism has had a negative impact on the church. So that's about it for this video. I just want to talk about what pietism was. I think the solution is just focus on theology and understand that it's not bad to have theological debates. I think theological debates are very good, and it often improves theology on both sides of the debate. Just something I want to talk about a little bit and share a bit of my own personal experience. So thank you guys for watching, and I'm going to speed up this video while I finish working on my house.